Quake II reminds me of a person with tons of latent potential, but doesn't quite reach the same heights as their predecessors. I really want to love Quake II, but I've always had trouble enjoying this game as much as Wolfenstein, Doom, and the first Quake game. As most Quake fans know, Quake II was never supposed to be a sequel to Quake, but instead an entirely original IP with its own story. Instead of slipgates and Lovecraft elements, Quake II has the Strogue and alien tech bases. The only reason the game was called Quake II was because it shared the fast-paced gunplay of Quake, which is a pretty silly reason, but whatever, it was over 20 fucking years ago. Like I said, I want to enjoy Quake II, but it's just not as great as Doom or Quake to me. Before I get into the negatives, I should talk about what Quake II does right, as it was an innovative game when it was released in 1997. When you boot up the game, there is an impressive CGI cutscene that plays, explaining the war between the Strogue and the humans. I'm not going to claim that I know a lot about Quake II's story, but from what I understand, it's as shallow as a kiddie pool. That's not to say it's a bad story or anything, it's just a typical aliens vs humans plot from an id Software game, and it just gets the ball rolling. Quake 2's story was followed up on with Quake 4 and it was fully fleshed out, which is good to see. Like all id Software titles, the gameplay is what counts, and Quake 2 is alright. It's not the worst game in the world, and if Quake 2 was id Software's worst game, then good on them for being so consistent for over 30 years. However, the game feels kinda boring nowadays, and the gunplay feels sluggish compared to Quake 1. Across Quake 1 and 2, the enemies remain bullet spongy, but in this game, you don't have fast weapons to compensate, or they are fast, but they have a quirk about them that make them less than ideal to use. The combat shotgun and the super shotgun are enjoyable to use and have a great sound effect, but they just feel so slow, and it's almost as if they both can't keep up with the action. In Quake 1, you almost immediately get into a good rhythm with the combat shotgun in the first level, and it's fun picking off the smaller enemy types. With Quake 2, the gunplay feels less than stellar, and this extends down to the machine guns. The submachine gun in Quake 2 has this annoying recoil that springs the gun up every time you fire, and the chain gun has this tedious wind down effect that gets in the way of combat. Now don't get me wrong, I'm completely okay with disadvantages for certain guns. Like maybe you use the combat shotgun on this type of enemy and not this type, etc. In Quake 2, however, the guns don't feel satisfying to use, and the cons make them not ideal to equip. The player does get acquainted with better guns later on, like the grenade launcher, the plasma gun, and the rocket launcher, but it might feel like a grating experience when first starting up the game with the initial set of weapons. The enemies themselves look pretty awesome, and each of them have unique functions and attacks in the levels. The parasites have this attack like a monster you'd see in Half-Life, there are your standard grunts that you can kill in a few hits, and there are also various types of biomechanical soldiers that can pose a threat if you're not careful. An innovative aspect about Quake 2 that has even transferred over into Doom Eternal is the destructible monsters feature. Like in Doom Eternal, when you chip away at an enemy, the game swaps their skin to appear more damaged. Of course, this was handled better in Doom Eternal, I mean this game is 20 years its senior, but Quake 2 deserves a ton of praise for it, and there are other revolutionary ideas like this that the game brings to the table. However, these don't save a less than great experience, and unfortunately for Quake 2, while it has innovative design elements, the game holds up less than Doom and Quake 1. Quake 2 is far from a bad game, but it's generally considered the weakest among the id Software catalogue. The game doesn't have any identity, and kinda recycles the greatest hits from previous games. You guys remember the BFG from Doom? It's back in Quake 2. Maybe I'm being a little too harsh on Quake 2, but identity is important, and it's difficult to distinguish it from other games at the time, aside from the technical leaps forward it made. Let's move into talking about those innovations, with the graphical improvements it made over Quake being the prime example. The core element of Quake II's gameplay is the objective-based approach to level design. Instead of running through singular levels and trying to get to an exit door, Quake II has the player running across multiple maps completing objectives to move on. You can open up a PDA to see what you need to do next in the game, and this could be considered a precursor to Doom 3's PDA system. There are 10 units in Quake II that are made up of a few levels each. The objective-based design is a great idea, and it was pretty revolutionary at the time, but the objectives themselves aren't that unique, and mostly consist of getting keys and doing run-of-the-mill 90s shooter activities. Additionally, the art direction and lack of variety in the levels make it a little annoying to backtrack through, and after a while, Quake II loses me. That being said, there are a few awesome looking moments in the game, but these are few and far between and are broken up by rather mundane tech bases. The part where you have to gain access to this massive pyramid is great, and it looks like something out of Independence Day. It looks alien, and when the game leans more into that extraterrestrial stuff, Quake 2 is at its best. You get some more awesome moments like that, and I'm not trying to paint Quake 2 as this pile of shit game, because at its core it's still good, but I can count those memorable set pieces on one hand. Quake 2 has good design, it's mechanically sound, and it's an id Software game at the end of the day, so you're bound to expect a quality product, but it's not that unique. Quake 2's lack of identity is the biggest issue with the game for me, and it's a problem I can't shake to this day. And now that I think about it, neither can id Software. Quake 2 was never supposed to be a Quake game, and it should have been a separate franchise when it was released. But since it's a part of the series, now what? You have gothic, Lovecraftian elements in Quake 1, and then the alien space marine stuff in Quake 2, and that leads id Software into an identity crisis with the Quake franchise. Do they lean into the Strogue plots, or do they go back to the eerie gothic atmosphere that was present in Quake 1? It turned out that they did neither with Quake 3, but that's another video for another time. When Quake 1 was released, it was the golden era of id Software, and while Quake 2 had a strong presence in the multiplayer scene, the game's single player came and went. Quake 1 was a mess of ideas, but it all came together in a weird way, and the style still works in my opinion. But with Quake 2, the issue is that it's just bland by comparison. As Civi11 pointed out, id Software became a brand, and the prime example of that is with Quake 2. We had shotguns, BFGs, and aliens, but Quake 2 didn't have its own personality, and perhaps if we didn't have Quake 1 to directly compare it, the game would have been received better over time. And even back in 1996, with the release of the first game, the franchise was dead on arrival. For Quake 3, they just made it multiplayer only, which was probably the smartest move they could have made to preserve Quake's legacy, and when they tried to salvage the Strogue plotline with Quake 4, it received a lukewarm reception. Now Quake is really only known for being a great multiplayer shooter, and there's no signs for a single player return in sight. Even though Quake Champions is continuing the multiplayer legacy of the series, Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal still have a bit of Quake's single player DNA in there. Doom 2016 has some gothic hell imagery, and it sort of falls in line with what the original Quake had. There are jump pads in the new Doom games, like in Quake, the arena combat is directly inspired by those games too, and the quad damage power-up is lifted from Quake as well. Quake's single player lives on in spirits, I guess, and while a new Quake campaign would be cool to see, I have no idea what they would do. Quake is the video game equivalent to the Halloween movie series. Like, they just go back and forth on what they want to do, and it's a complete mess. Even though Quake 1 was a giant hodgepodge of ideas, and id Software was essentially throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks, the original Quake thematically came all together at the end of the day, and Quake 2 is where the franchise first lost its way. Quake 2 is good, but unremarkable. And I hate saying that as a huge fan of id Software and the Quake games. I love the first Quake, and it's a shame that we're probably never going to see a game like it again, even though some of its ideas are being transferred over into the new Doom titles. Quake II has potential and does a lot right in the way of gameplay and being a decent shooter, but the gunplay is still a little sloppy and it's not as entertaining as Quake I, and it ultimately falls a bit short for me. I know that this game had a huge multiplayer boom, and if I was around back then, I would probably say that Quake II was a great experience, but to me, it is just a pretty solid game with a lack of vision. And this started the identity crisis of Quake and id Software. Next time, we'll tackle Quake III Arena, probably the most important game in the franchise.